I knew Judith Hargrove was trouble the first time she knocked on my door. She had that practiced, tight-lipped smile, a politician's smile, the kind that never reached her eyes. Dressed in an immaculately pressed pastel suit, her blonde bob cut razor-sharp, she clutched a clipboard to her chest like a weapon. "Mr. Calloway," she said, voice honeyed but firm. "A friendly reminder, your grass is precisely 1/4 inch taller than the HOA regulations permit. It must be trimmed by end of day, or I'll have to issue a violation. 1/4 inch. I almost laughed in her face. Instead, I leaned against the doorway, tilting my wheelchair back slightly. "I'm a little busy today, Judith. Maybe tomorrow." Her smile barely wavered, but the way her fingers tightened on the clipboard told me everything. She wasn't used to defiance. "Oh, I understand," she said sweetly, "but the rules exist for a reason. We all agreed to uphold the integrity of Oak Ridge Estates, didn't we? I hadn't agreed to anything. I'd moved in 6 months ago looking for peace, a place where I could work without distractions. I was a lawyer, one with a reputation Judith clearly didn't know about. I'd taken on corporate giants, shredded prosecutors in court, and made a career out of turning the tables on people who thought they were untouchable. And now, this woman, this self-righteous tyrant, in a pantsuit, was trying to regulate my grass. I could have argued, but I let it slide. It was easier that way. A clipped lawn wasn't worth a war. But Judith didn't stop at the grass. It started slow. A notice about my mailbox being the wrong shade of beige. A fine for leaving my trash bins out 20 minutes too long. A warning, because my porch light wasn't uniform with the others on the block. Then came the real power plays. One morning I found my wheelchair ramp flagged for non-compliance. The next week, I received a formal letter stating that my driveway had excessive cracks, though they were invisible to the naked eye. Each infraction came with a fine, and each fine came with a condescending note from Judith, signed in perfect cursive. She wasn't enforcing rules. She was testing me. I wasn't the only one. My neighbor Karen, a single mother, suddenly had an issue with the color of her curtains. The retired couple down the street got fined because their garden gnome wasn't in harmony with the aesthetic of the community. Every letter, every penalty, every complaint, Judith's name was on all of them. But what made her dangerous wasn't just the rules. It was the way she made people obey. She operated through whispers and fear. She manipulated board meetings, spinning complaints into community concerns. She had a small army of loyalists, eager to snitch, eager to enforce. People stopped questioning her because questioning her meant trouble. And when someone fought back, she escalated. I learned that firsthand when I received a final notice. Remove my wheelchair ramp immediately, or I'd be taken to court for unapproved structural modifications. That was it. That was the moment I realized Judith Hargrove wasn't just a petty dictator. She was a threat. And threats, in my line of work, were meant to be dismantled. I started keeping records. Every letter, every fine, every absurd demand. I attended HOA meetings and watched how she twisted words, how she manipulated homeowners into fearing her. She spoke with such certainty, such authority, as if she were the law itself. And then she overplayed her hand. It happened on a Friday afternoon. I was in my driveway, inspecting the supposed excessive cracks, when I heard the sound. Sharp, violent, metallic. A sledgehammer striking something solid. I turned just in time to see Judith Hargrove standing over the mangled remains of my wheelchair. For a moment, everything stopped. She was breathing hard, a manic gleam in her eyes. The sledgehammer dangled from her manicured fingers, its head resting against the concrete. She had that same tight-lipped smile, but this time it was different. It wasn't for show. She enjoyed this. Judith adjusted her blazer like she hadn't just destroyed the single most important thing I owned. "I warned you, Mr. Calloway," she said lightly. "Non-compliant structures aren't tolerated here." I stared at the wreckage, the twisted metal, the shattered wheels. The realization of what she'd done settled into my chest, heavy and cold. I looked up at her. She thought she'd won. That was her biggest mistake. Because I wasn't just a man in a wheelchair. I was the man who was about to ruin her life. But not yet. Not today. I let the silence stretch between us, thick and humming with the weight of what she'd done. Judith watched me, her chin tilted slightly upward, waiting for my reaction. She expected anger, expected me to lash out, to raise my voice, to demand justice. I gave her nothing. Instead, I looked past her, let my gaze drift over my wrecked wheelchair like it was an afterthought. The twisted metal, the shattered wheels, evidence of her arrogance. Then, with the smallest smile, I met her eyes. "That was a mistake," I said calmly. Her fingers tightened on the sledgehammer. Just for a second, just enough for me to see it. A flicker of uncertainty beneath the mask of confidence. But then it was gone. Judith exhaled sharply, an exaggerated sigh, like she was dealing with a child who refused to learn. "No, Mr. Calloway," she said smoothly. "The mistake was thinking you could ignore the rules." She let the sledgehammer drop to the pavement with a dull clang. "This is my final warning. Remove the ramp by Monday, or I'll escalate the matter." I tilted my head. "More than destruction of property?" She smiled, saccharine and sharp. "Let's just say I know how to handle problems." And with that, she turned and strode away, her heels clicking against the pavement like a metronome. I waited until she disappeared around the corner. Then, slowly, deliberately, I pulled out my phone and scrolled to the recording app. The little red light blinked steadily. Gotcha. Judith Hargrove had just handed me the match. Now, all I had to do was light the fire. The next morning, Oak Ridge Estates was buzzing. Not because of my destroyed wheelchair, not yet, but because of a new announcement from Judith, an emergency HOA meeting. I rolled into the community center on my backup wheelchair, an old, uncomfortable thing that squeaked every time I moved. Judith stood at the front of the room, flanked by her usual collection of loyalists. Behind her, a projector displayed a PowerPoint slide titled "Enforcing Excellence, a Stricter Future for Oak Ridge Estates." I almost laughed. She really didn't know when to stop. Judith cleared her throat, a smug little smirk tugging at the corners of her mouth. "Neighbors, I've called this meeting because we have a problem." She clasped her hands in front of her, pausing for effect. A problem of non-compliance. Murmurs rippled through the room. People shifted in their chairs. They knew what was coming. Judith continued, her voice carrying that sickly sweet authority she wielded so well. Certain individuals believe they are above the rules. Her gaze flickered toward me, but just for a second. They disregard regulations, refuse to maintain their properties, and, she exhaled dramatically, they undermine the standards we've all worked so hard to uphold. Silence. Uneasy. Waiting. Then, Judith gestured toward the projector. The next slide appeared. New regulations. Effective immediately. Mandatory aesthetic inspections every 2 weeks. Increased fines for repeat offenders. HOA authority to remove unsightly structures without notice, and at the bottom, in bold, any violations will be met with decisive action. Decisive action. The way she said it sent a slow, crawling anger through me. A woman in the front row, a mother of 2, lifted a hesitant hand. "Mrs. Hargrove, don't you think this is a bit extreme?" Judith smiled, but there was steel behind it. "Extreme?" She let out a soft chuckle. "My dear, what's extreme is allowing this community to fall into disorder." Another hand shot up. Mr. Patterson, a retired vet. "You're giving yourself the right to remove things from our homes without warning?" Judith spread her hands, the picture of faux sympathy. "Only when absolutely necessary." I watched the room. I watched the shifting glances, the nervous glances. They didn't like this, but they were afraid of her. She had built her reign on that fear. Time to crack the foundation. I leaned forward, deliberately rolling the wheels of my chair so they squeaked against the floor. The sound was small, insignificant, but it made people look at me, made Judith look at me. I met her gaze, held it. Then with a slow smile, I pulled my phone from my pocket and pressed play. Her voice filled the room. No, Mr. Calloway. The mistake was thinking you could ignore the rules. Silence. Then, let's just say I know how to handle problems. The shift was instant. Gasps, murmurs, eyes widening. I watched Judith's expression flicker, just for a moment, before she forced it back into a mask of calm. But she knew. She knew what I had just done. She lifted her chin, her voice clipped. That's quite the selective recording, Mr. Calloway. I smiled. I have more. Another flicker. Her hands clenched at her sides. I turned to the room. For months we've all watched this woman twist the rules. We've seen her bully homeowners, fine people over nonsense, and now she's decided she can destroy private property without consequences. My voice stayed calm, measured. If she's willing to smash a wheelchair, what else is she willing to do? The murmurs grew. Judith straightened, regaining her composure. This is an attempt to undermine the HOA. I laughed. No, Judith, this is an attempt to hold you accountable. Then, before she could respond, the doors at the back of the room swung open. A man in a suit stepped inside. Stern expression, a badge clipped to his belt. Judith turned, stiffening. Can I help you? The man's gaze swept over the crowd, then settled on me. Mr. Calloway, he said, we need to talk. And just like that, the room went silent again. The room held its breath. All eyes darted between me, the man in the suit, and Judith. She was the first to recover. Excuse me, she said smoothly, stepping forward with that practiced politician's grace. Who exactly are you? The man barely spared her a glance. Agent Harris, Federal Housing and Civil Rights Division. A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd. HOA meetings weren't the kind of place where federal agents showed up. Judith's expression flickered, just for a second. Then she smiled, polite and poised. Well, Agent Harris, I don't know what business the federal government has here, but this is a private HOA matter. Our regulations are well within the law. Agent Harris nodded, not in agreement, but acknowledgement. I'm not here for the HOA, I'm here for Mr. Calloway. His eyes found mine again, unreadable. If you don't mind, sir, we should speak privately. I studied him. He was good, neutral, professional. But there was something else, something careful, which meant he wasn't here to help. Judith knew it too. She folded her arms, turning. To me, with a look of manufactured sympathy. Oh dear, she murmured, just loud enough for the crowd to hear. Is there something you'd like to tell us, Mr. Calloway? The bait was obvious. She wanted control back, wanted to spin the narrative, and for the briefest moment, I considered flipping the entire game board on her right then and there. But no, not yet. I gave her the same calm smile I always did. Then, without another word, I rolled forward and followed Agent Harris out the door. Outside, the sun was dipping below the rooftops, staining the sky in bruised shades of orange and purple. The warm glow did nothing to soften the tension in the air. Agent Harris didn't waste time. You've been making waves, Mr. Calloway. I leaned back slightly in my chair, feigning ease. I do that. He exhaled sharply, not quite a sigh, not quite a chuckle. Look, he said, I don't know what kind of war you're fighting with your HOA, but you should know that your name has come up in some sensitive circles. I raised a brow. Sensitive how? Harris hesitated. That was interesting. Finally, he said, You're a lawyer, a damn good one from what I've seen, and you've made a lot of enemies over the years, the kind with power. His gaze sharpened. The kind who don't like loose ends. I went still. Judith, I'd been so focused on dismantling her little empire that I hadn't considered the bigger picture. She wasn't just some overzealous HOA president. She had influence, connections, and she had just tried to weaponize them. I let out a slow breath. Let me guess, I said. She called someone who could make my life difficult. Harris didn't answer. He didn't have to. I nodded to myself, piecing it together. Judith had pulled strings. She couldn't afford to have me tearing apart her kingdom, so she'd reached out. Maybe to an old friend in a high place, maybe to someone I'd crossed before. Someone who would love an excuse to put pressure on me. Classic move. I met Harris's gaze. "You're not here to arrest me," he shook his head. "No. You're here to warn me." Another pause. Then, reluctantly, "Yes." I tilted my head, watching him. "Why?" His jaw tightened, just slightly. "Because I've seen people like her before." His voice lowered, edged with something almost personal. "And I don't like what happens to the people who stand in their way." That was all I needed to hear. I pushed my wheels back, rolling a few inches away. "I appreciate the concern, Agent Harris. Really." Then, with a smirk, "But I don't scare easy." He didn't smile back. "You should." By the time I returned home, my gut told me something was off. It was too quiet. The air felt thick, charged, like the moment before a lightning strike. My house was exactly as I'd left it, at least at first glance. Then I noticed the door. It was locked, just like I'd left it, but not how I'd left it. I ran my fingers along the edge of the handle, the faintest scratch marks. Subtle, almost unnoticeable. Someone had picked the lock, then re-locked it to cover their tracks. Inside, everything looked the same. Nothing missing, nothing out of place. But I knew better. I wheeled into my office, went straight to my desk. My laptop sat in its usual spot. The drawer with my legal files was closed, but the lock on it, that was new. Someone had been here, not a burglar, a message, a warning. I turned, scanning the room, the walls, the windows. My eyes landed on the bookshelf, the framed picture on top. Of it, my father's old law diploma, had been tilted just slightly. I rolled closer, reached behind it. My fingers brushed against something small, a listening device. I plucked it from its hiding spot, held it up to the dim light. Cheap, efficient, standard issue for the kind of people who didn't want to get their hands dirty themselves. Judith. This wasn't just a power move anymore. It was war. A slow, satisfied smile pulled at my lips. She was getting desperate. Good. Because the game was just getting started. I pulled out my phone and dialed. A voice picked up on the second ring. "Well, well," came a familiar drawl. "Haven't heard from you in a while." "Yeah," I said, twirling the listening device between my fingers. "I need a favor." The voice on the other end chuckled. "What kind of favor?" "The kind that makes problems go away." A pause. Then amusement laced with curiosity. "Now you're speaking my language." I grinned. Judith Hargrove had just made the biggest mistake of her life, and by the time I was done, she was going to wish she'd never met me. I didn't waste time. By morning, the game was already in motion. My call the night before had set things in place. The kind of things Judith Hargrove couldn't control with her ridiculous fines and smug little smirks. I arrived at the Oak Ridge Estates clubhouse earlier than usual. People were already gathering, murmuring over coffee, their faces tense. They'd seen the signs, little shifts in the air, the way Judith's once unshakable grip on the neighborhood was beginning to slip. And today? Today, I was going to break it completely. Judith was already there, standing at the front of the room, arms crossed, her usual smirk firmly in place. But beneath it, there was something else. Something new. Tension. She knew something was coming. She just didn't know what. I rolled in, casual, unbothered, and took my usual spot near the front. Judith's eyes flicked to me, just for a second, then away. She was trying to pretend I wasn't a problem. She was about to find out how wrong she was. She cleared her throat, tapping her nails against the podium. "Let's get this meeting started," she announced. "We have some pressing matters to discuss." Oh, we did. I waited as she droned on about community standards, about recent concerns regarding non-compliance. But I wasn't listening. I was watching. Watching how her fingers tightened on the podium. Watching how the corners of her mouth twitched whenever someone in the crowd murmured too loudly. She was on edge, and she should be. Because this wasn't just another HOA meeting. This was her reckoning. I waited for my moment, then, calmly, Deliberately, I raised a hand. "Judith," I said, voice smooth. "Before we get too deep into your list of grievances, I'd like to address something important." Her eyes narrowed. "If this is another attempt to disrupt the meeting—" "Oh no," I cut in. "Not a disruption. Just a revelation." The room went silent. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. Then, with a flick of my thumb, I pressed play. A new recording filled the space. Not the one from before. No, this one was better. It was the sound of my front door clicking open, the sound of quiet footsteps, the sound of rustling papers, and then, clear as day, Judith's voice. "Make sure it's hidden well. If Calloway wants to play dirty, we'll bury him." The room froze. Someone gasped. Judith's face went pale, smiled. "Imagine my surprise," I said lightly, "when I found a little souvenir in my home." I pulled the listening device from my pocket, held it up between two fingers. "I'm no expert, but planting surveillance in a private residence? That seems like a bit of a legal problem." A ripple of shock swept through the crowd. Whispers turned to murmurs. Judith's mouth opened, then snapped shut. For the first time since I'd met her, she looked caught. Because she was. But I wasn't done. I turned to the back of the room, where I knew they were waiting. "Agent Harris," I called out, "would you like to take it from here?" And just like that, the doors swung open. 2 men stepped inside. Harris was in the lead, his badge flashing under the fluorescent lights. Judith stiffened. "This is outrageous," she hissed. "This is a community meeting, not—" Harris held up a folder. "Mrs. Hargrove, we've been looking into your activities. The complaints, the fines, the—" He glanced at me. "Surveillance." His lips pressed into a thin line. "And let's just say, you've been very busy." She shook her head, forced out a laugh. "You have nothing on me." "Oh, we do." He stepped closer, flipping open the folder. Fraudulent citations, misuse of HOA funds, coercion, extortion. He looked up. "Shall I continue?" The air in the room had shifted. The power she once held, it was gone. She felt it. She knew it, and for the first time, Judith Hargrove had no words. Harris didn't wait for a response. He nodded to the other agent, and just like that, Judith Hargrove, Queen of Oak Ridge Estates, was led out the door. People whispered. Some murmured. And then, slowly, someone clapped, and then another, and another, until the whole room was filled with the sound of people who, for the first time in years, were free. 2 weeks later, the HOA held a new election. Judith was gone. Not just from the board, but from the neighborhood. Her house, the one she had ruled from like a self-appointed monarch, was up for sale. No one missed her. Her reign was over. And as for me, well, let's just say my ramp was still standing, and I made sure the new HOA president knew one very important thing. Some rules are meant to be broken,